name is Jane Marie Hutchison, and I'm a teacher in New York City. I teach in Brooklyn, and right now I'm teaching 3rd grade. And today I'm going to tell you about a curriculum that I created for the staff at my school. It's an anti-bias professional development curriculum, and you see that it says in predominantly white spaces. It's because my school is predominantly white in both the student demographic and with the staff. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to create this and how, when I facilitated the curriculum, what I found and some more questions that I have after having done this last year. So when I first began teaching, I was teaching in schools where the students didn't look like me. I was teaching with predominantly African American and Latinx populations. And I was reading in my graduate research and in my professional developments about how white teachers really need to learn and have training about how to teach our increasingly diverse student population. And then a few years later, I started teaching in a completely different context where the student demographic was predominantly white. And so I began to wonder about these students and what do I, as a white teacher, owe these students in terms of preparing them for our increasingly diverse world in the United States. So let's think about what we know as in terms of what education looks like. So what we know is that the demographic of US teachers is over 80% white. What we also know is that the demographic of US students is changing rapidly and is increasingly diverse. Pew Research says that by 2055, there's not going to be a single ethnic or racial minority in the United States. And yet still, we have schools where there are predominantly white students and predominantly white staffs. And so I'm wondering, how do we prepare our white students and create, how do we help them become racially literate and anti-racist and anti-bias in a world that has been dominated by the ideology of whiteness? When I talk about whiteness, I'm not talking about the identity of being white. I'm talking about the ideology, meaning the system that continues to benefit white people at the expense of other racial and ethnic minorities. So why do white teachers need to become racially literate? Why do they need to have training on being anti-bias? Well, Gloria Ladson-Billings says, we teach what we value. And if you're never challenged as a white person to actually go beyond your own worldview, the worldview of whiteness dominates our society and is in the media, it's in schools, it's in other institutions. And if we are never challenged to go beyond that, we're going to continue perpetuating that in the classroom. Similarly, Mariana Soto Manning says, the white teachers exist within a society in which their experiences and their perspectives are already overvalued. So when we go into classrooms and we don't think twice about the ideology of whiteness, then we are only passing on to our white students an overly conflated identity, where they are continuing to think that their perspective, which we see dominating the discourse in our society, they're continuing to think that that is the way of doing things, and we have to disrupt that. So that's where my professional development curriculum came into play. I started thinking about, okay, well, what can I do for my white students? And then I started thinking about the context of my school. And I realized, okay, well, my school, it's an international school in Brooklyn, and we are predominantly white staff, but also we have over 50% of our staff who are from Western European countries. So their context for race and for bias and for discrimination is not the same as the teachers who were born and raised in America. And so how do we help these teachers? How do I say to these teachers, okay, go and teach with a social justice lens, go and be anti-bias educators if they don't have the know-how to understand what we mean when we say social justice and when we say diversity and when we say being an anti-bias educator? So my inquiry then was, how does professional development help teachers in predominantly white spaces engage with anti-bias and social justice teaching? And within this question, I wanted to explore how the role of dialogue in teacher learning could help this process. I wanted to explore the identity and the culture of the educators who are engaging in anti-bias teaching. And I wanted to critique the racial and socio-political context of the United States schools. So, I had a few theoretical frameworks that I used to situate this professional development curriculum. First is culturally relevant pedagogy. This session is titled Learning and Teaching Culturally Relevant Pedagogies. This was first authored by Latson Billings back in the 90s, and what she found was that there are 3 basic tenets that we can, as teachers, hold our students to. One being high academic success, so that means holding them to very high expectations and giving them the scaffolds to get there. And then the second one being developing a cultural competence, meaning that they become very sure of their own identity and their own culture while also learning about others' cultures. And then the third tenet being developing a critical consciousness. What that means is being able to question and critique the socio-political environment around them. So culturally relevant pedagogy informed my curriculum because I was thinking about educators' identities. How are the educators in this professional development curriculum going to develop their cultural competence? How are they going to learn how to critique the socio-political environment of United States schools? I also used critical race theory. Latson Billings was one of the first people to bring critical race theory to the field of education. The premise of critical race theory is that we live in a racialized society, and that while race is a social construct, it permeates our institutions, and we see it everywhere, including in education. So, if this social construct still affects our society and our institutions, then we have to push back on it, and that's the idea of critical race theory. And I would be remiss not to mention whiteness studies. I don't mention whiteness studies so that we can center whiteness here, but instead so that we can critique the ideology of whiteness and we can begin to dismantle it. Meaning that we are trying to disrupt those systems that perpetuate white people getting benefits at the expense of other people and other groups of people. So let me tell you a little bit now about what I did with this professional development curriculum. I created resources using teachingtolerance.org. It is a wonderful resource for educators. How many of you have used Teaching Tolerance before? Excellent. They have a booth downstairs in the exhibition hall. If you don't know anything about them, you can go by. I actually picked up, do you mind handing me that red booklet? Thank you. I picked up a few of their social justice standards booklets a few days ago, and they're gonna be up at the front if you'd like to take a look at the booklets after. But the social justice standards go through 4 different domains. The 4 domains are identity, diversity, justice, and action. And they're actually written for a K-12 context. And they're meant to be taught to students, developing their identity, developing their ability to be in diverse spaces and to think back and reflect on diversity, to think about justice, meaning bias, prejudice, stereotypes, discrimination, and to think about not just that we've learned all these things, but how can we take action. And I first came across these standards and I thought, great, I can't wait to use these with my students. But again, I was thinking, how do we go from teach these social justice standards without really giving to educators the opportunity to think about what we mean when we say identity, diversity, justice, and action. So, when I did the, sorry, I got ahead of myself. When I actually did the curriculum, I facilitated it with first I did a large group session with all of our staff. It's about 35 people. And then after that, I realized that there wasn't a lot of time. Time became a big part of what I found from my research and what I was reflecting on. Because our school has only a few of these PD days where students don't come to the school and teachers have meetings. And then the rest of our time, PD time, is actually relegated to meetings that cover logistics and curriculum. And so time is a huge constraint here. And when I actually met with I created a small group after this large group session, and teachers actually self-identified and said, okay, I'm interested in learning more about this. So we created a sort of professional learning community. And I created resources for to be done digitally. I was going to use WhatsApp, Padlets, a website, because I thought, okay, we are so busy as administrators and teachers, there's no way that teachers are going to be wanting to give up their physical time to meet after and before school. And actually, I found that the digital engagement was really low, and I had more engagement when we had meetings before school. And I also heard from international teachers saying, you know, I'm really processing all of these things that we're talking about, and I need more time with them. This material is actually going too fast for me. So time became a huge theme as I was looking back on the curriculum. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the bureaucracy of schooling and the idea of productive time. Now our schools are, we have this bureaucratic system of schooling, and the ways that schools prioritize time creates a lack of space for conversations and professional development sessions around topics of anti-bias teaching and social justice teaching. And the thing is that we structure professional development in a way where we can decide what is worthy of our time. That meaning, like, what is productive for us? And really at the heart of these discussions of being anti-bias educators, it's iterative and it requires a lot of self-reflection and going back and forth and back and forth. It's not a linear process. So it's hard to measure these conversations in terms of productive time. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how being an anti-bias educator really requires a lot of reflection and continuous development. It's not something that we can say, oh, I've arrived, I can check this off this list. No, it's not so easily categorized under productive time. Instead, it's something that we have to keep doing and keep working at. So I have some lingering questions after facilitating this curriculum. My first question has to do with this idea of bureaucracy in schools. And I'm wondering, how do bureaucratic systems in schools prevent us from participating in the critique and the self-reflection that's required for anti-bias work and teaching? I also have been wondering, how do we demonstrate that conversations around these topics are in fact worthy of our time, even when they don't align with our perception of productivity or come with measurable outcomes? And my final question is, how do we make familiar and commonplace the self-reflection and critique that goes along with anti-bias work? At the end of the year, when I was wrapping up this curriculum with the professional learning community I was working with, everyone in the group said, you know what, we want more. We want to meet more. We want the staff to do more. And there was this desire for us to be spending more time doing this. And I think that's a really special energy, an exciting energy to see from staff at your school. And my question now is, how do we continue taking this to the school system at large? How do we take it to our schools from administration to teachers so that they can understand how important this self-reflection and critique is to our work as educators? I'm going to end with a quote by someone who's really influenced me a lot, Bell Hooks. As I was doing this research, I read a book of hers called Teaching to Transgress. And if you'll remember, one of the questions of my inquiry was about dialogue, and how does dialogue help us? And she says, to engage in dialogue is one of the simplest ways we can begin as teachers, scholars, and critical thinkers to cross boundaries, the barriers that may or may not be erected by race, gender, class, professional standing, and a host of other differences. Doing this anti-bias work takes time, and it takes self-reflection. And if we are going to be the kinds of educators who disrupt bias and isms in our class, then we have to prioritize these types of conversations. We know that our students, whether they're white or whether they're from the cultural power or from minoritized groups, they need to learn about diversity, justice, identity, diversity, justice, and action. And it's an imperative that we create the time and space necessary for teachers to continually have this development, even when it feels counterintuitive to the constructs of our school day and our school schedule. Thank you.